32X, the beginning of the end for Sega dominance in the home console market. This $149 mushroom-shaped add-on went on sale in 1994, only to crash and burn within 1 year. What went wrong? On this episode of DF Retro, we're kicking off our failed hardware series with a closer look at the Sega 32X. Just how capable was the hardware itself, and how did its games stack up against the competition? To find out, we're exploring every single game released for the system. That's right, all 40 games running on real 32X hardware. And to pull this off, we're going to divide the episode up into 2 parts organized by genre. Today we'll be tackling racing games such as Virtua Racing Deluxe, platformers like Knuckles Chaotix, and fighting games like Mortal Kombat 2, along with full comparisons against other consoles from that era. Oh, and yes, that includes examining some of the worst games you ever play. It's all on real hardware, and it's all here on DF Retro. Let's get started. Before we jump into the games, let's talk about the hardware. The 32X is a mushroom-shaped add-on that fits in the cartridge port of your Mega Drive or Genesis console. It has its own power adapter and requires a pass-through cable to work. Most games combine graphics generated by the Mega Drive system with those produced by the 32X to create a complete image. Hardware-wise, the Sega 32X was Sega's attempt to bring 32-bit 3D gaming to owners of the 16-bit Mega Drive, but ultimately, it's not an especially powerful machine, nor was it really intended to be. It was cheap next to the upcoming Sega Saturn, which would launch just 6 months later at $399. The 32X combines 2 Hitachi SH2 CPUs, the same architecture featured in the Saturn itself, clocked at around 23 MHz. Unlike the Mega Drive, which draws tiles and sprites one scan line at a time, the 32X writes to dual alternating frame buffers, each with 128 kilobytes of memory. While more modern, this also proves to be sort of a weak point for the system, especially when dealing with 2D bitmap graphics. The 32X does not provide support for hardware scaling, rotation, or polygon acceleration. Everything you see on the 32X is handled by software. This underpowered yet complex configuration made development challenging, and with so little time on the market, few developers could really exploit its capabilities to any meaningful degree. It does support numerous higher color depth modes, enabling a larger on-screen color palette than the Mega Drive, while simultaneously featuring enhanced audio capabilities with PWM, not PCM, sample-based playback. All of this audio is then passed through the cartridge port where it's mixed with the Mega Drive sound. By examining every game for the system, we can better understand the strengths and weaknesses of the system. Everything you're about to see has been captured using real 32X hardware. No emulation here. But before we begin, note that many games run within a bordered window mode with a wider aspect ratio. For convenience, I've simply cropped these borders so that if you see a game nearly filling the screen, don't worry, the aspect ratio is correct. The image is simply zoomed in for improved viewing. Got it? Alright, let's get started. There's no better place to begin than with the 2 superscalar ports Sega produced for the system, Afterburner Complete and Space Harrier. Despite the age of these arcade games at this point, there was not yet an arcade or close to arcade perfect version available on home consoles. Afterburner Complete then was the first port of Afterburner 2 that managed to fully capture the look and feel of the original arcade game. There was previously a home conversion of the game on the Mega Drive, but well, it doesn't come close to matching the arcade original. At a glance then, the 32X version does produce visuals very much like the arcade game. If we compare the two in action, in fact, the results are surprisingly good. Sprite resolution is a little lower, but the overall look of the game is very close indeed. Even the music is virtually identical to the arcade, taking full advantage of the additional audio features in the 32X. Unfortunately, this system just isn't up to the task of running Afterburner 2 at a full 60 frames per second. Instead, it runs at 30 frames per second or half the rate. Compared to the original, it feels pretty sluggish. Of course, it's still a far cry from any previous home conversion of Afterburner, so in that sense, it's still kind of a success. We would have to wait until the Sega Saturn for a full frame rate conversion of the game. In comparison, Space Harrier comes a lot closer. This is a visually less demanding game than Afterburner 2, and it shows with a higher average frame rate on the 32X. Sadly, there is still a lot of slowdown, and it's not something we can analyze with our frame rate analysis tools since the 32X and Mega Drive layers often go out of sync. In action then, this means that the frame rate basically bounces back and forth between 30 and 60 frames per second depending on what's going on. But the gameplay speed is not tied to the frame rate, however, so the lower performance does not result in actual slowdown. It just produces less fluid motion. Space Harrier remains similarly accurate to the arcade conversion both in terms of music and visuals. If not for the drop in frame rate, this would be nearly arcade perfect. Both Afterburner Complete and Space Harrier are solid 32X titles then, slightly compromised arcade conversions that still manage to look and sound great even today. So how much of the 32X hardware is used then? Well, if we remove the pass-through cable and plug directly into the main console, we can see the Mega Drive layer exclusively. And in this case, both titles rely almost entirely on the 32X itself, rather than leveraging the Mega Drive hardware. In fact, only certain text elements and the joystick animation featured in the Attract mode make use of the 16-bit machine. Ultimately, if you own a 32X, do check out these games. Next up are the racing games, and there are 3 racers on 32X. Virtua Racing, BC Racers, and Motocross Championship. Let's start with the best of the lot, Virtua Racing Deluxe. Now this is a game that can justify the 32X. With Sega's talent behind this project, Virtua Racing 32X is one of the most impressive and fluid games in the system. But it wasn't the first home conversion. It received another port earlier in 1994 for the Sega Mega Drive. The original conversion used the SVP chip, designed to compete with the Super FX chip over on the Super NES. While the visuals are extremely dithered because of the limited color palette, the frame rate is double that of Star Fox and Stunt Race FX on the Super NES. It plays surprisingly well, but there is still clearly room for improvement. The dual SH2s and the 32X are much more capable of producing faster, more colorful 3D graphics, and it shows here. This is a game that demonstrates how talent and budget can overcome hardware limitations. The more powerful Atari Jaguar, for instance, received Checkered Flag, which looks comparable but runs at a stupidly low frame rate. Virtua Racing in comparison features more complex track design and a higher frame rate. It's also a significant leap up from the Mega Drive original. The 32X version now runs at a blazing 20 frames per second while the Mega Drive game is just 15. Still rather low, sure, but compared to the sub 10 frames per second titles we see with the Super FX chip and the Jaguar, well, it's not that bad. Compared to the arcade original though, it's obviously a step back, but the 32X does manage to hold its own. The arcade version features more complex geometry than 32X while running at both a higher frame rate and a higher resolution. And while the game is dated now, the flat shaded 3D still manages to look rather attractive overall without any warping or distortion ruining the image quality. It's a surprisingly clean looking 3D game. One interesting concession made to speed up the game is the elimination of collision detection on many objects. On Model 1, if you slam into a palm tree here for instance, you actually hit the tree and coconuts drop. Same deal with these signs over here. Now on 32X, if you drive into them, well, you just clip right through them. Not a bad way to save on processing power, since if you're playing well, you will never encounter this issue to begin with. With Virtua Racing then, the Mega Drive hardware is used exclusively for the 2D background layer, which is updated at the same frame rate as the 3D. By adding and removing the 32X layer, you get a better idea of how all of this fits together. And while the 32X does most of the heavy lifting in this game, we'll see some examples shortly that lean a lot more on the 16-bit hardware instead. Speaking of the Mega Drive itself, let's talk about audio. In this case, the 32X is only used for a couple of things. The sound played during the Sega logo, and a tiny portion of the background music, which sounds like this. So, as with the last two games, Virtua Racing is one title worth owning on the 32X. Next up is Core Design's BC Racers. Buckle up for the inverse of Virtua Racing. This is a game that exists on Sega CD, the 3DO, PC CD-ROM, and the 32X, and aside from the PC version, all of them run at an obscenely low frame rate. The 32X game is so choppy that it's nearly impossible to enjoy. The handling is rubbish, the frame rate is low, and the sound, well, just listen to this. Yeah, it's pretty bad. There's nothing remotely salvageable in BC Racers on the 32X, and that's a shame as Core Design had previously delivered some impressive sprite scaling action on Sega CD and other platforms. BC Racers is a step down from that. Amazing to consider that this was released just 1 year prior to Core Design's groundbreaking Tomb Raider game. Now, the game basically uses a flat 2D playfield that is scaled and rotated as you race, similar to Mode 7. Unlike Mode 7 Racers, however, BC Racers does feature a large number of 2D elements designed to represent scenery, in addition to the racers themselves. While this does add a layer of depth to the game, it doesn't make up for the sluggish performance. In comparison, games like Super Mario Kart on the Super NES run at 60 frames per second. BC Racers is just a fraction of that. Is there anything good to say here then? Well, I do kinda like the representation of a headlamp in the nighttime stage here. Perhaps the only good thing in the game, honestly. Okay, so for those curious about a comparison, here's how it stacks up against the Sega CD version. The one advantage on Sega CD, of course, is the use of higher quality music compared to the 32X version. You also get some cool animated cutscenes in there as well, which actually kinda hold up okay. Between the two, I actually prefer the Sega CD version here. As for the usage of the Mega Drive, well, the only thing Sega's 16-bit machine displays while playing BC Racers is the 2D background, which updates at the same low frame rate. It goes without saying then that you should avoid this game. It does not take advantage of the 32X in any significant way, and the frame rate and handling are just too low to be enjoyable. This is a bad game. Unfortunately, with our next title, things only get worse. Motocross Championship might just be the worst game on 32X. We're close to it. Yes, it's that bad. It uses a strange 2D engine of sorts which attempts to scale the terrain and riders as you plow through each track, but the frame rate is so low, the visuals so hideous, the audio so unlistenable, and the handling so borderline unplayable that it's almost impossible to get anything out of this at all. This might be the worst game to appear in a Digital Foundry video to date. Everything you need to know about the game occurs right at the starting line. Hit the gas and you find yourself in a horrible jumble of ugly rider sprites, and well, just look at this. Ugh. It is interesting though that the main rider sprite features a single higher resolution sprite used for the main riding position. When turning, jumping, punching, or really doing anything else, the artwork resolution is dropped significantly. This was likely a memory saving trick where the most viewed sprite is stored and displayed at a higher resolution. So that's kind of neat, I guess. And here's just a taste of the aforementioned awful sound. Yeah, that's pretty bad. And how does it make use of the Mega Drive hardware? Well, you get the Sega logo at the start, and then it doesn't actually clear that from memory. Without the 32X connected, that's all you get, which means the rest of this game is driven entirely by the 32X. It was developed by Artec Studios, which seemingly cut its teeth on Commodore 64, ColecoVision, and Amiga games, but this is its one and only 32X game. All I can say is stay far away from this one. There are 5, count 'em 5 fighting games on the 32X, 3 arcade ports, 1 original game, and an enhanced console conversion. Let's start with the best then, Virtua Fighter. First released for the arcades in 1993, Sega's Virtua Fighter was mind-blowing in arcades with a remarkable full 3D fighting game engine. You wouldn't expect this to work all that well on the 32X though, but AM2 handled this conversion in-house and the results are nothing short of incredible. The game plays very fluidly and manages to retain the same frame rate as the arcade game, while offering the complete selection of characters, moves, and stages. Keep in mind that this conversion was released after the disappointing Sega Saturn conversion as well, and while the visuals are further simplified in many ways, there are less visible glitches here, and it ultimately plays slightly better. This is what I'm talking about. On the Saturn, there's a lot of visible flicker as polygons warp in and out of view, and the stages are also clipped along the back edge with visible draw-in during gameplay. The whole thing just looks kind of unfinished. On 32X, while the overall geometric makeup is simplified, it feels more solid and stable in comparison. Of course, if we bring the arcade version into the mix, the difference becomes much more dramatic, as you would expect. The arcade version features more detailed models and stages than 32X, along with superior, higher resolution 2D backgrounds. It's just a better looking game all around, which is fair considering the cost of the hardware powering that version of the game. When you look at this game next to the Sega Saturn arcade iterations, it becomes clear that Sega AM2 really pulled a miracle here on the 32X. So as we've asked with every game thus far then, how did AM2 exploit the Mega Drive hardware for this one? Well, it's used very much like Virtua Racing Deluxe, with the 16-bit system handling all of the 2D background graphics, while the 32X handles everything else. Unlike Virtua Racing, however, that includes the sound as well. Virtua Fighter does make proper use of the 32X PWM audio capabilities to produce a richer sound than was otherwise possible on a stock system.
Ready, go!
It doesn't quite match the arcade original, of course, but it sounds very decent nonetheless. All in all, this is one of the most technically accomplished games on the 32X, and one of the best playing. But can we say the same of the other fighting games? Well, the next one we're going to look at then is Probe's 32X conversion of Mortal Kombat 2. You have to remember that at the time, Mortal Kombat 2 was a big deal, with releases across multiple platforms by the time the 32X had launched. The Super NES version brought blood to Nintendo's console for the first time, while the Mega Drive version offered, well, the expected results. It was pretty good. There were even handheld versions of the game released. Did you know that the Game Gear version of Mortal Kombat 2 uses background tiles to create the larger characters on the screen? Just one of the reasons why it's so choppy. Of course, the Game Boy is a lot worse. Alright, so MK2 was everywhere, and that includes the 32X obviously. But this is an interesting release as it's based heavily on the Mega Drive original while offering a few minor enhancements. So to start with, all of the game's background layers are handled exclusively by the Mega Drive hardware. This applies to many of the menus even. I mean, the 32X isn't even connected via the patch cable here, yet I'm still able to adjust the options. Now, the 32X was somewhat weak when it came to displaying large, complex tile-based playfields at high frame rates, something we'll get into shortly, and Probe opted to work around this by relying on the Mega Drive to handle this aspect of the game. As such, the 32X only displays character sprites and the HUD. With an expanded color palette then, the 32X version features more detail in the character sprites. It's subtle, but each one is less dithered than on Mega Drive, and the colors are definitely improved here. Now, compared to other versions of the game, the results are not especially spectacular. The Super NES really holds its own in this stage, with colors more accurate to the arcade original. In terms of size, the sprites are identical to the Mega Drive, which in turn appear ever so slightly smaller than both the Super NES and especially the arcade iterations. The improved color palette on the 32X does at least allow for shading closer to the arcade original, but it still falls short. The 32X also receives improved shadows over the Mega Drive version, while Super NES takes advantage of its transparent layer for shadows. Like the arcade though, shadows don't always line up realistically with the environment. Now, I mentioned earlier that the backgrounds are handled by the Mega Drive, but we still see some slight improvements on here despite this. Remember, the Mega Drive can only display 64 colors at one time, broken up into 4 palettes from a pool of 512 colors. But since the hardware no longer has to use its limited selection of colors to display the character sprites, or the HUD elements for that matter, a slightly broader palette can be reserved exclusively for background use. That might explain how the developers were able to improve them ever so slightly on the 32X. Then we have sound, which is a little bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, the 32X version features far more voice clips at a much higher quality than the Mega Drive version, which is great, but the soundtrack is powered exclusively by the older Yamaha chip. The tunes aren't bad, mind you, but I would have preferred something closer to the arcade original if possible. But taken as a whole, Mortal Kombat 2 in the 32X is a reasonably decent conversion that doesn't quite offer enough over the Mega Drive original to warrant its release. This is a minor upgrade at best. Even still, it's the second best fighting game on the system. So how about the next one? Well, Probe was rather busy on the 32X it seems, as it also developed the 32X conversion of Primal Rage. Remember this one? After Mortal Kombat blew up, developers the world over scrambled to produce similarly gory fighting games, and Primal Rage is one of those games. Unfortunately, it falls rather flat in terms of gameplay, with Mortal Kombat playing a lot better with its tighter controls and more satisfying animation. That said, the creation of Primal Rage is certainly fascinating. While Mortal Kombat relied on actors, Primal Rage was instead created entirely using clay figurines. Each fighter was handcrafted and placed in a variety of different positions that would then be captured for use within the game. With assets rooted in real-world objects then, clearly an increased color palette and additional memory is a must here. The arcade version uses massive detailed sprites with many frames of animation. It's a little dated to be sure, but it still holds up reasonably well, I think. On 32X though, the sprites are smaller and less detailed all around. Backgrounds are also reduced in quality and fewer animation frames are used. All expected from an arcade to home conversion at this time, if we're honest. Now for comparison's sake, here's how the 32X stacks up against the arcade and Sega Mega Drive versions of the game. The main improvement here over the Mega Drive stems from the increase in colors used for the character sprites. And as with Mortal Kombat 2, the Mega Drive also handles the entirety of the backgrounds. If we remove the characters from the playfield, you can see what I'm talking about. Of course, once again, the developers were able to focus all of the Mega Drive's power exclusively on backgrounds, which ultimately means improved color usage and more detail, since the 32X picks up the slack elsewhere. Similar to MK2, the audio leans heavily on the Mega Drive's Yamaha chip, but it does use the extra channels in the 32X to slightly improve audio quality all around. Primal Rage is not a game that pushes the system in any significant way, but it does at least offer a nice upgrade over the Mega Drive original, making it worthwhile picking up over that version. Next up though, is the 32X original, Cosmic Carnage. And this is an interesting one as it makes extensive use of the 32X to bring dynamic scaling to a fighting game on Sega's machine. The effect is similar to Samurai Showdown, but even more dynamic in some ways. The fighters are also rather detailed here, taking advantage of the 32X's increased color palette. The area on which you do battle is of course displayed by the 32X, while the backgrounds are handled by the Mega Drive. All of this would be great on paper, but unfortunately the game has some serious flaws. For one thing, the frame rate is rather sluggish for a 2D fighting game. It tops out at 30 frames per second, but often drops far below. Secondly, the game doesn't really play very well. The controls feel sluggish, and the moveset is rather limited. I mean, it's not terrible, but compared to top-tier fighting games like Virtua Fighter or even Mortal Kombat 2, it's a huge step back. So Cosmic Carnage, it's not a good game, but it's still a game that shows some promise. Perhaps with more development time, it could have been possible to craft this into something more enjoyable all around. Still, compared to this next game, Cosmic Carnage is an utter masterpiece. I'm talking about Brutal Unleashed, Above the Claw. Okay, so thus far, Motocross Championship has been the worst of the bunch, but Brutal Unleashed isn't too far off. It's a really, really bad game that also manages to fumble its 32X implementation. To start with, this is a pseudo-sequel of sorts to Brutal Paws of Fury, previously released on other platforms including the Mega Drive. It's not a good game by any means, but you can see that it at least scrolls smoothly. If we jump over to Brutal Unleashed though, it becomes immediately evident that something is wrong here. Yes, the character sprites still look terrible in motion, but the real issue here are the backgrounds. For the 32X version, you see, all background graphics are displayed using the higher color modes available on the system, the inverse of Mortal Kombat and Primal Rage if you will. Yes, that's right, the Mega Drive handles the HUD and character sprites this time, while the 32X handles the backgrounds. Unfortunately, the issue is that it does so at an obscenely low frame rate, Gone is the smooth 60 FPS scrolling from the Mega Drive and Sega CD versions of the game, replaced instead with this trash. It looks decent enough, sure, but the painfully slow scrolling is at odds with the fast-moving, hyperspeed characters, and the two layers don't even really seem connected. And those characters are a real issue here. It just feels terrible to play, one of the worst fighting games I've ever experienced without a doubt. Everything is far too quick and twitchy for its own good, some of the stages actually get in the way of the fight, and none of your attacks even connect properly with the other fighters. It just feels like a broken tech demo of sorts. But I can't ignore the few areas where the development team did at least manage to exploit the hardware. The most notable usage stems from audio. Unlike many of the games we've heard thus far, Brutal takes full advantage of the PWM capabilities of the 32X to play back sampled music tracks. Take a listen. It's a big step up from many other games in the system in that regard, I will say that much. The other thing I like is, well, the Sega logo here. Look at the sprite work here, it's so smooth and well animated, I love it. It's a shame we can't say the same of the in-game animation. So there we have it then, all 5 fighting games on the 32X. Virtua Fighter and Mortal Kombat 2 in the lead, with Cosmic Carnage coming in as an interesting example of sprite scaling on the system, alongside the somewhat mediocre Primal Rage, all topped off with the absolutely horrible Brutal Unleashed. I suffered through this game in the name of science. So who's ready for the next genre? But first, let's take a break with the ultimate 32X game.
Hello, I'm Fred Couples. Welcome to Golf Magazine's 36 Great Holes.
That's right. This is Golf Magazine 36 Great Holes starring Fred Couples. Ever wished Lee Carvello's putting challenge was real?
Welcome to Lee Carvello's Putting Challenge.
Well, it is. Golf Magazine 36 Great Holes starring Fred Couples has everything you could ever want in a game. Golf. 36 Great Holes. Fred Couples. More golf. Got a friend or 8? You can all play the game with a single controller. Add your friends to the list and choose from legendary golfers such as Fred Couples and, well, that's it. It's just Fred Couples. Then you can hit the links for a round or 20 of golf across 36 great holes.
That's the way to hit it.
Most importantly, Golf Magazine 36 Great Holes starring Fred Couples takes advantage of the 32X like no other game on the system. Plug in the Mega Drive alone, and all you get is the HUD. Everything else is handled by the Super 32X. Other systems look like this. But with the 32X, you get the real Fred Couples. Buy it today. Now on to the next section. Now it's time to get serious. There are 6 platform games on the 32X, and believe it or not, most of them are pretty good. Ranging from the colorful Knuckles Chaotix, the bizarre Tempo, and the moody conversion of Blackthorn, the system is filled with interesting side-scrolling action games. Unfortunately, some of these games also reveal one of the 32X's greatest weak points. Let's jump in, shall we? And we're kicking off with the most well-known of the bunch, Knuckles Chaotix, or just Chaotix in Japan. This game dates back to an early 1994 prototype available on the Sega Genesis, known as Sonic Crackers, or in the header file, Sonic Studium, which is likely a poor translation of Stadium from the Japanese characters. This prototype tethers Sonic and Tails together in a strange cooperative adventure of sorts. The prototype is very early, but it does give us a glimpse at what was to come. As development progressed then, Knuckles Chaotix itself went into full development for the new 32X, and as you can see, it's a beautiful game. The usage of color and tile design is really something special here, and it really still holds up today, at least from a visual point of view. At a glance, Chaotix appears to take full advantage of the 32X, but in reality it's more of a cooperative effort. You see, the entirety of the background is drawn by the Mega Drive hardware, and that even includes the rings, while the HUD and sprites are handled by the 32X. This approach ensures that the largest palette of colors available to the Mega Drive are focused entirely on the background layers, since the 32X is handling the sprites. The 32X also defines the background color. As a first-party title though, you might wonder why Sega opted to design most of the game around the capabilities of the Mega Drive. Well, think about it like this. The The 32X does not feature any special hardware for tile and sprite object handling, unlike the Mega Drive. It's all software driven on the 32X. Unfortunately, displaying complex tile-based playfields at 60 frames per second is rather challenging using the 32X alone, and thus, the only way to get the speed necessary is to rely on the older 16-bit hardware to handle background scrolling. The Mega Drive hardware is simply better suited to this type of game. This is an issue I highlighted in a previous episode with Gex and Samurai Showdown on the 3DO as well. Like the 32X, the 3DO draws to a frame buffer, but isn't quite fast enough to fill it at the necessary rate for detailed, smooth-scrolling 2D graphics. At least the 32X can fall back on the Mega Drive here. Thankfully, despite this, Chaotix works rather well, with the characters blending nicely into the scenery. This also opens up other unique possibilities. The programmers were able to leverage the 32X hardware to allow for things such as sprite scaling, for instance. Chaotix does, however, feature several 3D bonus stages which place you inside of a large polygonal structure while requiring you to collect orbs. This area takes full advantage of the 32X, but the camera snapping is poor and it ultimately feels rather unpolished. But then there's the audio. Knuckles Chaotix has one of the best soundtracks on the system, and its audio is a perfect marriage of the Yamaha YM2612 featured in the Mega Drive and the PWM capabilities of the 32X. The Yamaha chip plays the main melody like this. While the 32X handles the percussion and the underlying melody like this. And when you combine the two together, it sounds excellent. Taken as a whole, Chaotix still manages to look and sound great even in 2017. The development team certainly nailed this aspect, but unfortunately, things didn't fully come together on the game design side of things. Knuckles Chaotix is kind of a mess. The core mechanics work well enough on paper, and the introduction stage demonstrates how much fun they could have been in practice, but once you get into the game proper, it all falls apart. This is due primarily to poor level design. There is no flow or rhythm in this game at all. Each stage is a jumbled mess of ideas that never really come together. Now, Sonic CD is often dinged for this exact same thing with its exploratory level design, but there was actually a purpose there, and those designs work better. Chaotix doesn't even come close, and ultimately becomes more of a test of patience than a fun game. On top of that, the hardware itself just isn't able to keep up in many stages, with sustained performance dips interfering with the otherwise polished visual design. Which is why Knuckles Chaotix is ultimately one of the most disappointing games in the system. Sure, it plays a lot better than the likes of Brutal, Unleashed, or Motocross Championship, but it falls short of reaching its promised heights. This could have been an amazing title and maybe even one of the best on 32X, but in the end, it just doesn't come together. Next on the list, though, is one of the strangest titles on the system.
You know what time it is. Yo, homie, peep him! Tempo, check it out, you know he makes it funky, and he's good to go. Bang, bang, catch the groove with New York, LA, and San Francisco.
Yes, it's Tempo, a trippy platform game with some truly lovely visuals. Tempo comes to us courtesy of Red Company, the studio behind the Bonk series of games, among many others. You remember Bonk, right? It was a strange but cool series of platformers first introduced on the TurboGrafx-16, otherwise known as the PC Engine in Japan. Armed with that knowledge then, it should come as no surprise that Tempo is an extremely bizarre game. It's also one that could mostly have been done without the aid of the 32X. And there's a good reason for that. You see, the majority of the action in Tempo is handled entirely by the Mega Drive itself. Yep, while this may be a 32X title, the stage foreground and all of the sprite work is displayed entirely by the 16-bit console. So what does the 32X even bring to the table then? Well, for one thing, the trippy backgrounds are all rendered by the system. In some stages it looks great, but in others it's so bizarre to the point that it's borderline distracting. The 32X also displays the entirety of the introduction sequence as well as the boss fights. That's right, in this scene the 32X is only used for scaling and moving the boss around the screen, and it doesn't even do a great job there as the boss updates at a lower frame rate than the rest of the game. The 32X audio capabilities are also used here for the backing percussion track as well as the catchy introduction song. Taken as a whole, Tempo is a unique game with a cool visual style that is still fairly enjoyable to play. Some of the level design can feel a little chaotic at points, but it's still a good time. It just doesn't really do a whole lot with the 32X hardware, and we might have been better off with more traditional backgrounds in certain stages. Believe it or not then, Tempo actually received not one, but 2 sequels. Tempo Jr. over on the Game Gear, and Super Tempo on the Saturn, which unfortunately is insanely rare and expensive. Alright, so next on the list of platform games is Pitfall: The Mayan Adventure. Now this is secretly one of my favorite platformers of that generation. Seriously, once you learn the game it can be a whole lot of fun. And on paper the 32X version should have been excellent, but in the end it's a port that highlights just how weak the 32X can be when handling 2D bitmap graphics at a high frame rate. On its original platforms then, Pitfall is a grainy looking game, but it's super well animated and features a great frame rate. It does take a little time to get the hang of, but once you do, it's a lot of fun. Over on 32X though, you might notice something a little off. It's very choppy. That's right, the 60 FPS of the original game is replaced with a sluggish frame rate that jumps between 20 and 30 frames per second. Well, at least partially. And I only say partially because the backgrounds used in the game are identical to the Mega Drive and Mega CD versions, and of course are displayed by the Mega Drive itself at 60 frames per second. This results in a huge mismatch between the choppy foreground and the silky smooth background visuals. So if the frame rate is quite low, what do you get in return? Well, with the 32X handling the foreground and sprites, the developers leveraged the increased color palette to produce more visually pleasing artwork. The dithering from the original game is eliminated entirely, and the end results are rather lovely. These same background tiles would later be reused in the PC version of the game even. Of course, none of that really matters when the frame rate is so low. It just plays so much worse than the other iterations of the game, well, save for the Atari Jaguar version, which also runs at just 30 frames per second. Pitfall is a great example of why many developers designing 2D games for the 32X opted to lean so heavily on the Mega Drive. The 32X itself just wasn't all that well suited to pushing around large, complex playfields at 60 frames per second. And just for good measure, here's how the game stacks up against the Super NES version. I was never a fan of the SNES version due to the stretched sprites, simplified background layers, and less precise controls, but it still looks a lot better in motion than 32X. Thanks to these issues then, my favorite version of Pitfall remains the Mega CD version. It looks like the Mega Drive game, but the music is so much higher quality. The PC version would be up there too, but it's an early Windows 95 game that is annoyingly difficult to work with. While Pitfall falls flat on its face then, there is another game which manages to tackle this very issue quite well, and that one is Calibri. Designed by the folks behind Echo the Dolphin, Calibri is a unique exploration-based shooter where you play a hummingbird. Calibri manages to make great use of the 32X hardware and is one of the only titles able to deliver smooth scrolling at 60 frames per second while using the expanded color palette of the 32X along with sprites. Of course, this may have become easier to pull off due to the relatively simplistic design of each stage. Most of the game world is nothing more than a backdrop. That is, there's rarely any sort of collision present and you can simply fly freely around within the limited confines of each stage. It makes reasonable sense seeing that you play a hummingbird, but it also means that there isn't really much to the level design. The game would play exactly the same even with a completely black background. Even still, the visuals are at least rather attractive and they definitely add a lot of atmosphere, which is important. Calibri also takes great advantage of the 32X sound capabilities. As with Knuckles Chaotix, the music is divided up between the 32X and the Yamaha chip within the Mega Drive. The 32X also handles most of the sound effects. This combination allows for some rather excellent atmospheric sound in some areas like this. There's really not a whole lot more to say about Calibri then. It's a very simplistic game with a unique visual style that takes moderate advantage of the 32X. It also sticks out since it's one of the only 2D games on the system that can use the higher color mode available on the 32X without having to drop the frame rate. Next up on the list of platformers then is Blackthorn, which kind of isn't a typical platformer. You remember Blackthorn, right? The game with this? Yeah. This dark action game follows in the footsteps of Flashback in Another World with its screen-by-screen action focused on light combat and puzzle solving. It was created by Blizzard Entertainment and initially released on the Super NES and PC. While Blizzard is responsible for the creation of the original game then, the 32X conversion was handled by Paradox Development, which would go on to become Midway Studios Los Angeles, at least until closure in 2008. What's interesting about this conversion is the fact that it makes full use of the 32X hardware. It's likely that the game would never have appeared on the Mega Drive due to its limited color palette, which wouldn't have worked very well with this game. In bringing it to 32X, however, Paradox went one step further and redesigned much of the game. That's right, rather than stick with the gorgeous original artwork on the Super NES and the PC, Paradox decided to take inspiration from the likes of Donkey Kong Country and other similar games by rendering out 3D models on a PC and creating new sprites from that. When you stack it up against the original then, it feels like a step back in many ways, and it all comes down to the art direction. This may have looked okay back in the mid-90s, but a lot of this early CGI has aged rather poorly, and that is absolutely the case here. In comparison, Blizzard's work on the original game remains timeless and still holds up really well today. When it comes to the background work then, we see a mishmash of designs here. The foreground tile work is all based on Blizzard's original art direction with some recolorization, while the distant backgrounds are all new on 32X and look rather awful compared to the original. The moody thunderstorms and lightning flashes of the SNES game are long gone, and the colors now kind of clash with the foreground. I'm also not a huge fan of the display panel on the right side of the screen. Yes, it was in the PC version as well, and on 32X it's even displayed by the Mega Drive, but I've always found it to be slightly distracting compared to the Super NES game. It would seem that the reason is pretty simple though. The original background graphics were designed for the 256 pixel width of the Super NES, while on PC, the game outputs at 320 by 240, which means you either have to stretch the visuals or box them in. If they had made the original art at 320 pixels wide though, that might have made a SNES version more difficult, so I can understand why they went with this solution. At least the audio is excellent and takes full advantage of the 32X. Take a listen. The 32X even has new levels included, so it's a longer, more difficult game all around. Taken as a whole, Blackthorn is a solid effort that does utilize the hardware well. It's just unfortunate that the artwork was mangled in the process. The new stuff isn't terrible per se, but it all feels like a step back from Blizzard's original vision. Still with me? Good, because it's time to look at the worst platformer on the 32X, Spider-Man Web of Fire. It also happens to be one of the most expensive and rare games for the system, being that it was the very last retail 32X game to be released. Web of Fire was developed by Blue Sky, the crew behind Vector Man and Jurassic Park on the Mega Drive. Those games weren't great, but they did have some decent action in it and looked very impressive for the system, but in comparison Web of Fire feels really sloppy. It's a forgettable action game with very poor hit detection and lousy level design. It's just not a lot of fun. But there is some merit here, in terms of how it uses in 32X. While the Mega Drive handles all of the background graphics, the foreground and sprites are handled by the 32X, and it does so at a reasonably good frame rate. There is some slowdown here and there, but it still manages to run better than most other examples of 2D games on the 32X, save for Calibri. Seeing how this game runs, it's a shame that Pitfall the Mind Adventure couldn't also pull it off. Really though, it's just about the only thing interesting or good about this game. The levels make no sense and just involve swinging around, fighting through random, boring areas that seem to repeat. It doesn't feel good to punch or attack your enemies, and the whole thing just kinda drones on. There have been a lot of bad Spider-Man games over the years though, and many of them are worse than Web of Fire, but even still, this is not a good game. The only reason you would ever want to own it is to complete your 32X collection, and who doesn't want to do that? And with that out of the way, we've now looked at each platformer on the 32X. No truly great games in here, but most of them are at least fairly fun to play, so it's one area where the 32X hasn't fared too poorly. Now before we get to our very last genre for this episode, let's take another break and look at something unofficial. Wolfenstein 3D. This game was never officially released on the 32X, but a very talented programmer going by the name Chili Willy, who has been very active in the 32X scene, decided to bring the game over himself, and the results are rather good. It looks and plays great at a very smooth frame rate for the 32X. This is the proper Wolfenstein 3D. Even better, the game supports Mode 1 audio using the Sega CD, so if you play this on real hardware via a flash card and have a Sega CD attached, you can insert a music disc into the drive where it will play CD audio during gameplay. You can burn the official Wolfenstein soundtrack to a disc if you like, or you could just pop in about anything else into the drive like this. Kinda cool, right? It's pretty neat to see Wolfenstein 3D running on the 32X. In fact, this conversion is good enough that it almost feels like it could have worked as a retail release back in the day. It's a shame it never happened. Wolfenstein wasn't the only id game on the 32X, however, but we'll get to that next time. For now though, let's get to the last chapter of this episode. We're talking strategy games, and the 32X has exactly one of them. Sokushi IV, better known as Romance of the Three Kingdoms in the West. This game is a Japanese exclusive released for Koei, the only Japan exclusive for the Super 32X. The game has been released across a wide variety of platforms though, including the Super NES, Sega Saturn, and even the Dreamcast, among others. The 32X version remains entirely in Japanese, however, with no attempts to create a translation patch for those that can't read the language. I'm not really into these games myself, but I will admit that it does at least look rather nice on the 32X, taking full advantage of the expanded color palette for improved visuals. It is a nice step up from the Super NES version, which uses Mode 7 for its main map, and it also has relatively decent sound, though not comparable to the excellent Sega Saturn version. Really though, it just seems like a perfectly adequate installment in the series, and there really isn't a whole lot more to say about it. Which means it's time for the wrap-up.
There's a hardware revolution brewing in interactive entertainment systems with lots of new machines in development. Now, some of them will be cool and some of them will suck.
32.
There we have it. Part 1 of our 32X feature is complete. What did you guys think of the games thus far? Personally, I think there are some real gems here on the system. In particular, all of AM2's games really shine brightly, even today. Before we jump into released games, I thought it would be interesting to delve into a few prototypes, games that were being worked on but ultimately never released. After all, the 32X was only on shelves for a short time, and we never really got to see what many developers could do with the hardware. One of the most impressive efforts then is X-Men Mind Games. This unreleased game was shown at E3 1995, but years later a prototype was leaked, allowing us to take a closer look. The game was in development by Scavenger, a short-lived publisher with studios around the world, including Xerix and Lemon. While it's not clear which team was working on X-Men per se, both Xerix and Lemon had roots in the demo scene and worked together to help produce this rather impressive 32X tech demo, which really showcases what might have been. Xerix had already proven itself previously with the mighty impressive Red Zone back on the Mega Drive, which did all sorts of interesting things with the hardware. X-Men itself is a curious one then. It's a game that uses 3D environments with sprites, giving the world a sort of depth. The prototype doesn't play especially well, of course, but the idea is interesting and there was some potential here. The environments feature plenty of texture detail, and it's clear that the engine was quite capable. It runs a lot faster than some of the other textured 3D games in the 32X. Had the 32X stuck around for a little longer then, this is a game that could very well have been released. Then we have Virtua Hamster, which is a super strange concept that involves running a hamster through a series of tubes. The demo is highly unpolished and early, but showcases stable 3D flat-shaded rendering at a smooth frame rate. I'm not sure a hamster simulator was the best idea for such a niche platform though. Another more interesting one is Soulstar X, a conversion of the Sega CD game from Core Design. Core was also responsible for last episode's awful BC racers, but Soulstar X looks promising with improved visuals over the Sega CD original and smoother performance than BC racers. This was also being developed for the Atari Jaguar around the same time. Of course, these are just 3 interesting titles out there, but there were reportedly a lot more 32X games in development at one point. Castlevania Symphony of the Night, for instance, started out on the 32X in some form, often going by the title Bloodletting. But when the 32X started to fail, Konami shifted focus over to the PlayStation instead. Sega even had a Sonic game in development for the system that would feature 3D graphics. Probably better that it was never released though. Clearly, with such a poor reception then, the 32X was never realistically going to receive much support. Its death was imminent just after launch, and we're left with just 40 commercially released games, which we're gonna finish covering right now. Nothing shows off the prowess of a new system quite like a space shooter, and the 32X has 5 of them, so let's start there. From the impressive Shadow Squadron, system-pushing Darkside, and the unique Zaxxon's Motherbase 2000, the 32X has you covered. You must remember that this genre was huge back in the mid-90s. The PC was all about space games like Wing Commander and TIE Fighter, so it's no surprise that the 32X has a lot of games focused on this theme. To kick off, let's start with my favorite of the bunch, Shadow Squadron, also known as Stellar Assault in Japan. This is an interesting take on the space sim genre that showcases some of the smoothest visuals on the 32X. It was developed by Sega CS with mechanical designs provided by the design studio Artmic. As a result, the game shares design elements with the OVA Gull Force. Once you jump into the game itself then, Shadow Squadron begins with an impressive launch sequence that sees your ship smoothly lock into position prior to launching. A system check pops up, and once complete, you're blasted out into space. Shadow Squadron does a great job of showcasing what the 32X can do. While it focuses on flat shaded polygons, the models are all reasonably complex, and the frame rate is surprisingly stable. Shadow Squadron is also one of the only games to make use of the 32X's 15-bit RGB direct color mode. The reason for this is simple. Most games on the system rely on a 256 color palletized mode as a result of memory limitations. Each of the 2 available frame buffers feature just 128 kilobytes of memory, making it difficult to fit a complete 15-bit frame in there. To work around this then, Shadow Squadron uses a resolution of 288 by 224, which is surrounded by a black frame. The larger color palette allows for smoother shading with less visible dithering across many 3D objects. There is still some minor dithering present of course, but overall it's one of the cleanest looking 3D games on the system. We also see some clever tricks in use here. The sun and laser blasts, for instance, rapidly cycle colors 60 times per second, even though the game only updates its 3D polygons at 20 frames per second. This makes it tricky to analyze the frame rate then, as color cycling interferes with the frame counting. Still, through some strategic clipping and trying to avoid looking at the sun, well, it's actually possible to see that the game does indeed operate at just 20 frames per second, with some wobbliness here and there. Okay, so the 3D looks excellent and the game plays relatively smoothly, but how does Shadow Squadron exploit the Mega Drive hardware? Simple, the cockpit overlay. The 60 FPS status check and mission briefings are all handled by the 16-bit hardware. If you remove the Mega Drive layer though, the 32X then handles all of the 3D objects in the scene, including the color cycling applied to select surfaces. The audio unfortunately only makes limited use of the PWM capabilities of the 32X. Take a listen. Yep, it's just a basic melody and part of the percussion. Everything else is played back using the Mega Drive's Yamaha chip. Still, taken as a whole, Shadow Squadron is easily one of the most impressive games on the 32X and also one of the best playing. Believe it or not, it even received a sequel of sorts on the Sega Saturn known as Stellar Assault SS. This was created by a different developer, however, and is also extremely rare at this point, but it's kind of worth checking out. Of the 2 though, I prefer the 32X original, and it's one of the games that you have to own for the system if you have a 32X. Another impressive looking game then is Darkside. This cart is one of the less common 32X games and also only available in PAL regions. It's a 3D take on asteroids and just happens to stand out as one of the only 32X games to feature fully textured polygons and primitive lighting. Displaying fully texture-mapped polygons in this fashion is a real challenge for the system, as the simplistic video display processor offers zero support for even the simplest 3D affine line rendering. Everything here is written in assembly code for the dual SH2s, enabling the game to draw texture maps on its polygons. In terms of 3D performance though, the 32X isn't that far off from what you'd get using a mid-range 486 PC back in the day, which is to say, it isn't well suited to rendering 3D at high frame rates. So as impressive as these results may seem, it also kinda demonstrates why flat shaded polygons are ultimately a better fit for the platform. The severe texture warping is certainly bothersome, yet expected, but the performance is the real problem here. Darkside runs at an obscenely low frame rate when objects are in close proximity to the camera. It picks up somewhat during normal gameplay, but it never feels anywhere near as fluid as Shadow Squadron. So, as such an advanced title then, how does Darkside make use of the Mega Drive? Well, like this. Yep, it doesn't use the Mega Drive at all for any visual rendering. The 32X handles 100% of the visuals on display here. That's kind of neat, right? Of course, the Mega Drive's Yamaha audio chip is used in combination with the 32X PWM capabilities, and the results are generally pretty good here. Overall, Darkside stands out as one of the most impressive technical feats on the 32X, displaying visuals that seem impossible for the platform. And to a degree, that's completely accurate as the frame rate is so low, it almost was impossible. Due to the high cost of the cartridge then, this is one that I cannot recommend seeking out. The next game though is quite different from the previous two titles, Zaxxon's Motherbase 2000. It shares a spiritual connection with the original Zaxxon, but ultimately plays nothing like it. This is an original isometric game that focuses on taking control of different craft as you blast your way through an isometric environment. Technically speaking, it's an interesting mix. All moving objects within the world are constructed from flat shaded polygons, enabling a sense of depth that the original Zaxxon was lacking. Despite the low polygon count, the designers at CSK managed to deliver some unique looking enemy ships that animate smoothly while throwing a huge number of them around the screen. This also enables some rather large boss battles with creative ways to defeat them. The background graphics then are entirely two-dimensional and make use of the system's expanded color palette. This means smoother color gradients that more closely match the source renders. While it's difficult to be certain, Motherbase 2000 might be one of the few games using the 32X's higher color modes similar to Shadow Squadron, as the resolution of the playfield does not fill the screen. The rest of the image is made up by the status bar and parallax background behind the isometric playfield, both of which are handled by the Mega Drive hardware. The game plays well, but unfortunately the frame rate is a little too low for a shooter like this. This is one title that would really benefit from a 60 frames per second update. Still, despite those issues, in many ways, Zaxxon's Motherbase 2000 is one of the more interesting games for the 32X. It's a fun little shooter with unique mechanics and a solid visual style. Definitely worth a look. Next up is Star Wars Arcade, one of the most hyped releases for the system. Based on the 1993 Model 1 arcade game, Star Wars Arcade is basically a simplified space shooter. Unlike the previous two titles, players are limited to maneuvering within a specific area, making it more difficult to engage with enemies. While the game itself isn't particularly brilliant, the visuals on display are among the most impressive for the system in many ways. Similar to Shadow Squadron, Star Wars uses flat-shaded polygons to represent ships and scenery. As this is based on a Model 1 arcade game then, it's likely that the game was programmed to use quads, though without dedicated 3D hardware, the 32X is certainly capable of triangles as well, something not possible on the Model 1 or the Sega Saturn. What stands out about Star Wars then is the Death Star approach. Players can fly down and around the surface of the Death Star in real 3D. The clipping distance is limited, resulting in noticeable pop-ins, sure, but for the time this was an impressive display of real 3D that exceeds many comparable spaceflight games. Unfortunately, performance can dip to unacceptable levels during these sections, making it more difficult to play, which is a real problem as the game itself is rather tough. Performance analysis is also difficult with this one. The game updates various parts of the image at variable intervals. The 3D polygons might update first, followed by one set of particles, then another set before updating the 3D again. Based on this pattern, the primary 3D visuals then update at 20 frames per second. And that's just for this part. When you're out in space, the game updates closer to 30 frames per second. And when things get really busy, it can drop below 20 frames per second. So we're really looking at an incredibly variable level of performance here. As for the Mega Drive utilization, Sega's 16-bit machine is used to display the cockpit overlay, specific particles designed to give the impression of speed, and of course, Admiral Akbar.
Stand by to receive orders.
Audio is limited as well. The PWM capabilities of the 32X handle many of the sound effects and speech, but all of the music, aside from the introductory piece, is handled by the Mega Drive's Yamaha chip and doesn't sound great. It's not a bad effort overall though, and it's one of the only Sega Star Wars games to receive a proper home conversion. If you owned a 32X back in the day, this was probably one of the games you had in your collection. The last of the space-related games then is none other than Star Trek Starfleet Academy, Starship Bridge Simulator, a port of the Super NES game by the very same name. Brought to you by Interplay and High Voltage Software, Bridge Simulator on 32X makes surprisingly good use of the hardware. The space action itself is rendered using simplistic 3D polygons, but the 2D backgrounds used throughout the game are lavish with detail and rich with color. Compared to the Super NES original, it's a nice upgrade with smoother color gradients and more color detail throughout. The 3D scenes are of course also rendered at higher quality on 32X, though the frame rate is rather low in both versions. All of the areas outside of your ship have been redrawn as well compared to the Super NES version. So while it is a very similar game, the look and feel has been enhanced greatly here and it works quite well on Sega's little system. The audio is another area where the 32X version excels. By combining the Yamaha YM2612, which handles this portion of the melody, with the PWM capabilities of the 32X, which sounds like this, High Voltage Software delivers a rousing rendition of the classic music. It's a nice step up from the muffled Super NES version. The Mega Drive usage is also rather clever. The 16-bit machine is responsible exclusively for the flashing lights used on the deck. That's it, simple color cycling. And it works pretty well. Ultimately though, there isn't a lot more to say about this one. It's a solid conversion of the Super NES game that improves upon its original release in every way. Well done, High Voltage. And with that, we've covered all of the space combat games available on 32X. So let's move on to the next genre. Now we're talking. Doom was one of the hottest games of its era, and getting a competent console conversion of the game became an arms race of sorts. Doom has been released on a huge number of consoles, but the 32X version is one of the very first made available. So is it any good? Well, yes and no. The 32X version is presented in a small window with a significant border around it. The colors are limited, with lots of visible streaking present throughout the game. Many of the animations are missing, and sprites are only stored facing the camera, making it impossible to sneak up on foes. On top of that, only the first 2 episodes are included here, and not even every map is present, plus they've all been simplified. Lastly, the music was absolutely destroyed, with low-quality Yamaha synth versions of the original tunes spoiling the atmosphere. That doesn't sound great, right? Well, it's partially made up by the fact that this is Doom, and it runs smoothly. Compared to other conversions at the time, the 32X version is one of the fastest available with a smooth frame rate and solid control. Simply put, it plays just as you would hope, and that makes it a decent overall conversion. John Carmack himself ported the game to 32X, and the code is based on the Atari Jaguar version, which John was also working on. Doom was sold as one of the main reasons to get a 32X back in the day. PCs were still quite expensive at the time, and a console conversion was the most cost-effective way to enjoy the game. For those wondering, here's how Doom makes use of the Mega Drive hardware. Just the status bar. Everything else is handled by the 32X. It's just a shame that they didn't make better use of the 32X's audio capabilities. Oh, and if you're looking for more Doom, don't worry, it's coming. But as for the 32X, that's it. Doom is the only official first-person shooter available on the system. There's other first-person games, of course, but nothing else quite like Doom. So let's move on to the next genre then. And now it's time for the main event. That's right, there's 2 wrestling games in the 32X, but only one of them can emerge the victor. On one side we have WWF WrestleMania the arcade game, on the other, WWF Raw. Let's start with the best there ever will be, WrestleMania the arcade game, possibly the greatest wrestling game of all time. Released by Midway during its digitized sprites craze, WrestleMania the arcade game is all about fast fighting action in the ring. It plays more like a fighting game than a typical wrestling title, and as a result, it's a ton of fun. The Sega 32X version was ported by just 2 people and strives to deliver visuals closer to the arcade game. At a glance then, it's still a ways off from the large sprites of the original arcade, but it looks reasonably nice. It's only when you pull in the original Mega Drive version that the improvements become evident. The 16-bit version uses the system's lower resolution mode and simply lacks the colors necessary to deliver the artwork. The 32X in comparison offers a much higher color palette and more detailed sprites. Unfortunately, this comes at a cost. The frame rate is dropped to just 30 frames per second on 32X versus the silky smooth 60 FPS of the Mega Drive game. After last episode, this should come as no surprise then, as the 32X is rather sluggish when handling 2D bitmaps due to the lack of tile and sprite acceleration. So how about the Super NES version? This one features a higher color palette than the Mega Drive, but still falls short of 32X. It's also lacking 2 of the characters and features plenty of slowdown, especially when 3 characters are on screen, even though the base frame rate is 60 FPS. So how does this game make use of the Mega Drive? Well, it offloads part of the background of the 16-bit machine. It's interesting to see just how closely linked the hardware is in this title, so while the Mega Drive could probably have handled the backgrounds at 60 FPS without a problem, it wouldn't have lined up properly with the 30 FPS sprites on 32X. Still, considering that just 2 people worked on this project, the results aren't really bad, and the game itself is amazing. So what about WWF Raw? Well, here's all you need to know. Yes, it still has Bret the Hitman Hart, but aside from that, Raw is not war, it's just lame. It looks poor compared to the arcade game with grainy artwork all over, the animation isn't great, and it feels terrible to play. Yeah, it's an improvement over the Genesis game visually, but once again, the frame rate is lower on 32X, and the jump in visual quality is relatively minor. This is still an ugly game no matter where you play it. This is kind of all you need to know when playing Raw. This game sucks. If you want a wrestling game on 32X, then you know what to do.
Bring it on, bring it on, bring it on. What you gonna get? Gonna get respect. What you gotta get? Gotta get respect. What you wanna get? Respect. So how
Okay, now things are about to get crazy. There are 6 games available that take advantage of both the 32X and the Mega CD, and one of them is almost non-existent, as we'll see in a moment. From what I understand, the most significant limitation with this Mega CD/32X setup is the lack of available system memory on the 32X. With cartridge-based games, the included memory in the cart works in tandem with the system and video memory, but when playing a game from the CD, the game only really has access to 256 kilobytes of memory on the 32X side. Aside from the limited market potential then, this might help explain why these sorts of games were so uncommon. As a result of this, these CD32X games focused entirely on full motion video, with the 32X essentially acting as a video decoder. This allows for larger video with an expanded color palette compared to the ultra-limited Mega CD. Let's start with the best of the lot then, Night Trap. This controversial game focuses on security system management as players flick through security cameras in order to trap vampiric augurs wandering around the house. It's a strange game, and on CD32X, it's also greatly improved. The main difference is, of course, the improved video playback. The frame rate is identical between the 2 versions at 15 frames per second, but the color palette is massively increased on 32X. It's a huge step up in terms of quality. There are also some differences in certain film sequences, and it features an improved interface. That's about all you need to know about Night Trap then. The next best FMV game has to be Fahrenheit, which tasks players with stepping into the shoes of a firefighter. What makes this one interesting is the way in which it uses on-screen prompts to offer the player choice. In that sense, it feels more like you're exploring a virtual scene a la Myst or The Seventh Guest. It's still rather limited, sure, but it's kind of a step up from many other FMV titles of this era. It also features some of the highest quality video on the system with playback that nearly fills the screen. As you can see, the difference in video quality between the two is even greater than in Night Trap. The expanded color palette absolutely transforms the game. It's a grainy mess on the Sega CD in comparison, but rather nice on 32X. This was a later title then, and the US version shipped with 2 discs, one for Sega CD and the other for 32X. You always have to put the first disc in first though before playing, as it acts as sort of a key disc for the 32X version. Next up then is Slam City with Scottie Pippen, and oh boy, this is something else.
Man, fingers holds the ball too long.
It's because he's posing for pictures.
It's full of 90s attitude that is oh so entertaining to watch. And it just shows how overly ambitious Digital Pictures was getting at this point. Trying to create a full-on basketball game using video is a crazy idea. And it almost works, but is ultimately kind of a lousy, unresponsive, and difficult to play game.
Man, I almost broke a sweat running points on you so fast.
If it were easier to play then, it might be good for a laugh, but it's just so frustrating. Amazingly, it ships on 4 CDs with each disc containing a single player. And as before, we see enhancements over the original release. Improved video playback and an enhanced interface all show up on the 32X. It follows the same trends as the previous games. The 4th game then is Corpse Killer, and man, this is one horrible game. It's basically a rail shooter of sorts, something that would work out okay in arcades later with games like Area 51, but it falls flat here. The video is choppy and the enemies look terrible as they sort of float towards the camera. And all of this is backed up with a rather unique story to say the least.
Hi, Julie Barnes, journalist. Sure you read my stuff. Syndicated. But when I break this story, I'll have a book, late night talk shows, TV, the works.
And once again, we see those extra colors come into play on 32X, allowing for much improved video playback. Yep, those extra colors sure help bring these amazing actors to life. We're almost done now. How about Game 5 then, Supreme Warrior? If you thought basketball played with video was a bad idea, how about a fighting game? Supreme Warrior has to be the most frustrating fighting game in existence, and I use that term lightly. It basically devolves into a game of pressing the right button within a small window in order to trigger the correct video. Your hands and feet play little role in attacking, as damage only really occurs when you nail that window. And how about the 32X usage then? Yep, you guessed it, more colors and a modified interface. That's about it. And there's just one more game to mention that unfortunately I don't have access to, a 32X version of Surgical Strike. This is an ultra rare CD32X game that only released in Brazil. It looks like someone is working on getting a reprint out there, but as far as original copies go, this isn't something you're likely to run into. There aren't even any ISOs out there readily available for this one. Ah well. And that's all of the CD32X games. Exciting, right? Well, FMV was certainly hyped back in the day, but even at the time most of us realized that these types of games were just too limited to be fun. Of the bunch though, only Night Trap really sticks out for its unique security video approach to gameplay. It's still rather simplistic, sure, but it's a fun, cheesy sort of game. It's worth checking out, if nothing else, at least for the history lesson.
Get free, get free, get free.
Next up, we're looking at first-person mechanical combat games, of which there are 2 on the 32X. Sega's own Metalhead, and a conversion of the original arcade game, T-Meg. Let's start with Metalhead. Alongside Star Wars Arcade and Doom, Metalhead was one of those 32X games that was paraded around in magazines and commercials at the time. It's a first-person mech-based title that has players running through a city, destroying targets while taking orders from this handsome fellow.
Your first mission. Destroy all enemy mechs in the city near the border.
Let's be clear though, Metalhead is not a great game, but it is one that uses the 32X in interesting ways. Similar to Darkside, Metalhead makes use of fully texture-mapped 3D polygons. Buildings and mechs alike are fully textured and managed to look excellent for the system. Impressively, texture warping is kept to a reasonable level here, with a level of stability that feels competitive with other 3D systems of this era. The clipping plane is rather near the camera frustum, unfortunately, resulting in noticeable pop-in, but Metalhead still manages to feel relatively advanced for its time. Performance, on the other hand, is a real problem here. The game hovers between 10 and 12 frames per second at pretty much all times, making for an experience that never feels fluid or fast. It's starting to encroach on Super FX chip territory here. It's one of the choppiest games on 32X by quite a wide margin. The game itself is dull as well, with super stiff controls and boring mission objectives that typically involve running around the same city blasting brain-dead enemies. In terms of how it makes use of the Mega Drive hardware, well, the 16-bit machine renders the cockpit and the 2D background. That's basically it. Even this guy is handled by the 32X. Ultimately, Metalhead is an interesting little game, but not a whole lot of fun. It's definitely one of the more technically competent games on the system though, but it doesn't hold up. Okay, so what about the other mech game then? Well, I suppose it's more of a hover tank game really, a console conversion of T-Mech. Released in arcades back in 1994, T-Mech is essentially an updated take on the Battlezone formula, built using scaled sprites. In the arcades, machines were connected to allow for full-on multiplayer capabilities. It received two home ports, one for the 32X and the other for MS-DOS PCs. The 32X version stacks up reasonably well against the arcade. The resolution of everything is lower, and the frame rate isn't as stable, but it looks rather similar. The battlefield essentially consists of scaled bitmap images based on pre-rendered CGI. The basic setup is not unlike Sega's own superscalar games, lacking only in terms of art design. The sprites work reasonably well too when it comes to displaying a pseudo 3D environment. Of course, T-Mech also makes use of mesh transparency for explosions and the blue light, which is a step back from the arcade game. In comparison, the PC version is an upgrade over the 32X version, with visuals much more in line with the arcade game. It dishes the mesh transparencies used on 32X and generally runs smoother. Too fast on modern PCs actually. The Mega Drive is used here as well for the 2D background layer, as we've seen in many other games thus far. All in all, there just isn't a lot to say about T-Mech. It's a middle-of-the-road hover tank action game that makes reasonable use of the hardware and stands as one of two home conversions. Truth be told, I'm surprised that this one didn't make it to the Atari Jaguar instead. First up, we have NBA Jam Tournament Edition. Jam left a huge impression in the arcades in the early 90s by introducing fast-paced arcade-style basketball that appealed to even those that weren't into the sport. So how does NBA Jam fare on the 32X then? Well, not bad. You can see that the court graphics are lacking color compared to the arcade version, but the sprite work is relatively close. It's a nice looking conversion of the game. The main limitation here lies with the fact that the Mega Drive handles the courtside graphics. This is what allows for smooth 60 frames per second performance, but it also means that fewer colors are available. It's a similar situation as we saw with Mortal Kombat 2 then. Oh, and thanks to the shadows, it's actually still possible to play the game even without the 32X connected. So while it's true that the background graphics can appear somewhat grainy, it still ultimately manages to feel closer to the arcade game than, say, the Super NES version, which offers smaller sprites and less detailed overall visuals. Of course, the best version of NBA Jam, at least in my humble opinion, is the Sega Saturn conversion, which is basically arcade perfect save for a tiny bit of loading. The one area where the 32X kinda stumbles though is the audio. It just doesn't sound great and is a big step back from the arcade version. Still, you could do a lot worse than the 32X version of NBA Jam TE. That's actually pretty impressive for the Game Boy. Not bad. Okay, next up is FIFA Soccer 96. And this one is more interesting than you might expect. You see, for years, FIFA on consoles looked basically like this. An isometric style game with a rather low frame rate on both 16-bit machines. Though the Mega Drive does have a performance advantage here. Then in 1993, Electronic Arts unleashed FIFA International Soccer for the 3DO interactive multiplayer. and it was a revelation. It looks rough now, but this was the first time FIFA was displayed in full 3D on a console. Well, the players were still rendered using sprites, but still, this felt like a next level experience. And when you add in the awesome sound, it was genuinely impressive. When FIFA finally made its way to 32X then, it might have been easier just to bring the Mega Drive game over with more colors, but EA actually went the extra mile and created a fully 3D FIFA game for the system. It uses sprites like 3DO alongside a 3D stadium. It isn't quite as detailed as the 3DO version of course, but it still manages to hold up reasonably well. At least aside from the rather low frame rate, but these games were never known for great performance back in the day. It would of course be overshadowed quickly by subsequent games, but the 32X version of FIFA was an interesting milestone for the series. It was also likely the beginning of EA's distaste for Sega after their otherwise long, fruitful relationship. Next up then, baseball, and we're starting with RBI Baseball. The equivalent RBI games on the 16-bit machines look like this. But over on 32X, RBI Baseball features much larger character sprites and an increased color palette, at least while batting. Once the ball's in play though, the scrolling is jerky and the visuals are just grainy. It's a step down even from the Super NES version in that regard. So yeah, it's an interesting step forward in some ways, but it's ultimately nothing special. It does make use of the hardware for the expanded color palette, but really that's about it. It's also one of the cheapest games you can buy in the 32X, with carts coming in well under $20 most of the time, which I suppose is still a little pricey for an old sports game. But if you want to talk pricey in sports games, let me introduce you to World Series Baseball from Blue Sky. Yep, this is the same developer behind Spider-Man Web of Fire, and these games share more than just the developer. As I alluded to, yes, this is an expensive and rare game, one of the least common games for the system, and also one of those games that makes getting a complete collection rather difficult, since who wants to shell out hundreds of dollars for a sports game? Especially one like this. I feel that at a glance the game at least looks better than RBI Baseball, but suffers from many of the same visual issues, including choppy scrolling in the outfield. The art direction is superior and the color usage is better, but overall, it's not a great looking game. It does, however, make full use of the 32X hardware. If you look at just the Mega Drive layer, you basically get just some of the overlays and, well, the ball itself. Aside from that then, the rest of the visuals are handled by the 32X. Now, I'm not a huge fan of baseball games, mind you, but based on what I have played in the past, this definitely is not the kind of baseball game you want to invest in. It's slow-paced, difficult to hit the ball, and just not a lot of fun. The only reason to own this cartridge today is to complete your 32X collection. Good luck with that. Alright then, next up is Tough Man Contest, a one-on-one boxing game with a passing similarity to Nintendo's Super Punch-Out! It's a decent game first released on the Mega Drive, but one that ultimately failed to gain traction, so an enhanced port was cooked up for the 32X. This is another EA Sports title, but unlike FIFA, this one shares a lot more with the original 16-bit release. The main improvement here comes from the background, which takes full advantage of the expanded color palette. It's brighter and less grainy than before, a huge improvement. On the other hand, all of the characters and sprites are handled by the Mega Drive hardware, but without having to worry about sharing its color palette with the background, the fighters are mildly improved, though perhaps not to the degree you might hope. Still, this isn't a bad little game. It's a reasonably enjoyable little boxing game that is worth a look since the 32X version is relatively cheap. But we still have one last game to go, NFL Quarterback Club. Yes, this is a game that hails from that mythical time when multiple football games were available to choose from. This was Acclaim's entry, and honestly, it's not terrible. Visually speaking, we're looking at a rather nice upgrade from the 16-bit version. On Mega Drive, the players and field lines float on top of a green background used to represent grass. The background uses line scrolling for perspective when moving left and right, but is otherwise disconnected from the lines, so it looks rather strange in action. On 32X then, the game uses a textured 3D field of sorts that moves properly with the camera. It looks a lot closer to what you would expect from a pseudo 3D football game. Like FIFA, both versions make use of sprites for players, but the animation and general fluidity of the game is a step up from Madden titles of the era. As you can see, it also makes use of 32X itself quite well, with very little displayed by the Mega Drive hardware. Ultimately, it's a football game for the 32X. What else do you need to know? Okay, let's wrap this up then. And there it is. Every 32X game ever released in the bag. While this exercise in examining the system has certainly been time-consuming, it has been equally enlightening. This is a system with a deservedly bad reputation, but looking at the library as a whole, it's perhaps not quite the disaster you might think. There are some genuinely great games in the 32X. On the other hand, it's also clear that the hardware itself just wasn't strong enough to compete. It was ill-suited to handling 3D at a high frame rate, but also struggled with 2D bitmaps due to the lack of sprite hardware. In many ways, with its dual SH2s, the 32X is sort of an undercooked Sega Saturn. Still, it's not difficult to be fascinated by what was released. So, be sure to let us know which 32X games you found the most interesting here, and if you still own the system, be sure to share some photos of your collection over on Twitter. Let that 32X shine.